Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Going to finish off our seminar, inshallah, with a section on zakat and sadaqatul fitr. And I'm going to get through this, inshallah, as quickly as possible. It's not as long as the fasting. I am going to omit some sections in relation to, for example, zakat on livestock and cattle, because that's not really a common masala for our lifestyle here. It's unlikely that people are going to be paying zakat here on livestock and cattle. Did you have a question, brother? Sorry. So first of all, the meaning of zakat, the word zakat means purification. So literally, lexically, zakat has two meanings. The first is purity, such as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, take from their wealth so that you might purify and sanctify them. وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ. And this zakat in this meaning is used, tazkiyah in the meaning of tazkiyah, of purification, is used quite a lot in the Quran. It's one of the roles ascribed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as well. And the second meaning is growth, is extra and growth. Such as when a person says that the plants have grown in Arabic. Right? You can say zaka az-zar'u in Arabic. That means the plants have grown. So they both have a link with the technical meaning of zakat as well, because when we say zakat, we think about money or about giving sadaqah and charity in the way of Allah. So what's the relationship between purification and growth? Well, zakat purifies your wealth. The remainder is considered to be purified by whatever zakat you give. That's the connection. And growth, although visually, so you got, let's say you got £1,000, you've given £25 from there in terms of zakat to you, it seems like your wealth has decreased. But in terms of barakah and how that lasts you, the remainder grows. Right? So there's an aspect of purification and growth in both parts. So zakat, according to the sacred law, is the ownership of a certain amount of wealth that has been prescribed by the law for a poor Muslim who is not a Hashimi and neither a slave of a Hashimi. Because Banu Hashim, the family of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, basically is prohibited from taking zakat. This is to basically venerate them. It's a degree of honor for the descendants of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his family, that they shouldn't be given zakat and they shouldn't take or receive zakat. So basically, it's ascribing a set portion of your wealth, transferring that ownership to a poor person who is eligible to receive it. That is called zakat. The rulings, so who is zakat? Obligatory upon, just as in fasting, zakat is obligatory upon a person who satisfies 5 conditions here. So 5 conditions that need to be met for zakat to be obligatory upon a person. Number 1, same as usual, Muslim, must be aqil, of sane mind, must be baligh, of an age of maturity. And there's 2 additional ones. One is that he should be a free man, not a slave, or man or woman, not a slave. Why? Because a slave doesn't actually own anything of their own. They have no possessions. Technically, they are possessed by somebody else, like they are a possession belonging of somebody else, and anything they own belongs to that person. So they're not obligated to pay zakat. If there was a Muslim slave, he or she would not be obligated to pay zakat. And number 5, one must be in possession of a nisab. Nisab is the term that is used for, in English, you could say threshold. So nisab is the minimum threshold that you must be at in order for zakat to be obligatory upon you. So you have to have savings that amount to a certain amount, and we'll go through that momentarily. So he possesses and owns the equivalent of a nisab, and nisab can be in different forms. So nisab could be a certain number of cattle, certain number of sheep, certain number of cows, right? And then you have reached the nisab, therefore you are liable for zakat within those animals, can be paid by way of animals or by way of money. Similarly, crops, even in agriculture, by land which is not irrigated by artificial means, is naturally irrigated, is liable for 10% of the yield to be given as zakat, which is known as ushur. And gold, silver, and merchandise for business. Gold and silver are the common standard, and it is their value which is normally used to calculate our zakat, and we'll come to that in a moment. So conditions that obligate the payment. The conditions that obligate one to pay zakat is the possession of the original nisab, minimum amount, for one complete year. So we must have owned that for a complete year. This sometimes causes confusion. I'll just explain that right away. Beginning of the year and end of the year, that's what's taken into consideration. Any peaks and troughs in the middle are disregarded. If at the beginning of the year, so for example, someone pays, there's a zakat in the month of Ramadan every year, let's say for argument's sake, 15th of Ramadan. If on 15th of Ramadan last year, he was above the threshold, come 15th Ramadan this year, he's above the threshold, any peaks and troughs in between are disregarded, even if there came a time during the year where he was absolutely penniless. Doesn't make a difference. It makes it very simple. It makes it a lot easier to manage that calculation. So it's beginning of the year, end of the year. That's what's taken into consideration. And in order for the act of offering the zakat to be valid, the one paying the zakat is required to intend zakat, and may do this when paying the zakat to the poor or at the time when he's separating the required amount from the rest of his wealth. So let's say for argument's sake, you've got some money saved at home. You withdraw, remove some of that and say, you calculate your zakat, let's say £500. You remove £500 from your saving, put it separately and say, this is zakat money. And that, at that time, you're making that intention that this is money for zakat, which I'm going to pay with. That's fine. When it comes to paying it, even if there's no intention of paying zakat, that will suffice. Because at the time of removing it and separating it from your money, you've made that intention. Then at the time of distribution, you don't need to have that intention. It's not necessary. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is actually at the point of distribution. And so when you come to distribute it, you make the intention that this is zakat. The other person doesn't have to know about it. They don't need to know that it's the person who's receiving does not need to know that. So it's not a stipulation for the poor person receiving the zakat to know that he is receiving zakat. Same will apply, for example, if your savings are in a bank account, if you go and withdraw some money from your account, and at that point you're making the intention at the point of withdrawal that this is for zakat, then at the point of distribution, you don't necessarily have to have that intention. The types of wealth which zakat must be paid on. There are 5 types of wealth on which zakat is compulsory. Number 1 is cash, gold, and silver. So I've included cash in there because that is our equivalent of gold and silver. In our currency, in our monetary terms, what is our equivalent? We don't buy and sell things. We don't trade in gold and silver anymore. Our equivalent of that is cash. So cash, gold, and silver. The second, and I'll explain a little bit more about the nisab. When you come to looking at the nisab for cash, for gold and silver, then I'll explain about cash in there as well. Second one is livestock, and they are camels, cows, and sheep. According to Imam Abu Hanifa, zakat is also required upon horses as well. The third is merchandise of trade. The fourth is on that which the earth produces from crops and plantations of fruit. And number 5 is treasure troves, right? So minerals, gas, coal, etc. If you basically happen to have an oil well in your back garden, that might apply to you. So something along that line. So out of them, those that are really that we're going to be dealing with, there's gold, silver, and cash, number 1. And number 2 is merchandise. That's what we'll be focusing mainly on. The information is there. It's fairly self-explanatory. If you wish to read through the rest, of course, by all means do so. And if you ever have any questions, you're more than welcome to ask us at any time, whenever I'm available or accessible to you. But for the purpose of this session, or our session, we're going to focus mainly on those masail that are actually relevant to us. First of all, what is the nisab of gold and silver? We're going to go through it systematically. Gold and silver. So zakat is not due on gold until it reaches 20 misqal. Right? That's a traditional unit, misqal. Approximate weight being 85 grams. So if you have less than 85 grams of gold, there's no zakat on it. And with respect to silver, there is no zakat due upon it until there are 200 dirham. Approximate weight 700 grams. 82 grams of gold, 85 grams of gold, 700 grams of silver, which is required before zakat is due. When gold reaches 20 misqal or 85 grams, 2.5% of that must be paid in zakat. And same applies to silver as well. And then for every 4 misqal, that's in excess of 20. Right? So 20 is your benchmark. Then from 21, 22, 23 up to 24, there's nothing, just below 24, nothing extra. It's the 2.5% of that 20 misqal. And then when it gets to 24, then it increases again as a whole final increment, and it goes up in this way in every 4. So the additional amount that is over and above the 20 misqal incurs no fee until it reaches 4 misqal, which is approximately 17 grams. So it would be the same for between 85 and 102 grams, just under 102. My maths is correct. And then when it gets to 102, then it's 2.5% of the whole again. So it goes up in increments like. When the silver reaches 200 dirham, it is necessary to pay 2.5 on it, which is 5 dirham. And then for every 40 dirham, 1 dirham is added. So when it goes up by 40, you add another dirham. And when it goes up by 40 again, add another dirham. Right, so this is the ruling held by Imam Abu Hanifa, whereas Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad said whatever increases upon the minimum amount requires to be paid, even if it is very little. And the basis that is more beneficial for the poor, this is what the fatwa would be given upon. This is what should be practiced. So not that you've got, let's say, for example, you've got 100 grams of gold and you only pay 85 grams worth of zakat, you should pay for the 100 grams. Because that extra few pounds may not make a difference to you, but might be a substantial difference to someone who's eligible to receive it. So pretty much all the laws of zakat in our Hanafi madhab favor the poor. Right? So it's what is more favorable, anfa lil fuqara. That's the term that we use. Nafa means benefit, anfa means more beneficial. Anfa lil fuqara, we follow that ruling which is more beneficial for the poor person, for the recipients of zakat. Okay, so this is if you have actual gold and silver. So let's say you've got actual gold, if you have only 84 grams, or if you're looking at mithqal, you have only 19 mithqal, you're 1 short or a few grams short, no zakat. Actual silver is 700 grams, even if it's just a few short, there isn't any zakat liable on that. And if, for example, you had, let's say 1 year you had 85 grams of gold, you actually gave some of that gold as the zakat, it then falls below the benchmark. Now there's no zakat until you actually acquire more gold and it goes back up above the threshold. So I hope that's fairly self-explanatory. That in terms of actual gold and silver, it's that exact amount. And if you pay off in gold and silver, it's going to decrease. It's going to go below the threshold. And if it does at any point, then you're not liable for zakat again until you acquire more gold or silver, which takes it above the threshold. Now, there's different masail here. There's different issues. What happens if you don't have full amount of nisab of gold and full amount of silver, but you've got a mixture of both. What do you do then? Based on that principle, anfa' lil fuqara, that which is more beneficial for the poor, you will convert the gold into units of silver based on the value. And then see if you can make up 700 grams of silver instead. And if you're above that, you will equate the value. So let's say, for argument's sake, you've got 80 grams of, or 50 grams of gold. You got 500 grams of silver. They're both below. What can you do? Technically, person could say there's no zakat on them because they're both below. But you should practice that which is more beneficial for the poor. And so if there's a combination of two nisabs, they'll both be put together. The value of the lower one, so silver obviously is cheaper, will be taken. Gold will be converted into units of silver. So whatever the value of that 50 grams of gold will be added to the silver, total amount calculated, and zakat paid on it, because it will most definitely be above the threshold for silver. Same principle applies for cash. Cash is neither gold or nor silver. So how do you calculate? You calculate, and if somebody's got their phones right now, you can have a look. Today's value, just out of interest, is check what the rate is for 1 gram of gold. Multiply that by 85, and you'll get the nisab of gold as for today. And check what 1 gram of silver is worth, and multiply that by 700, and you'll get the value of the nisab for silver today. So if someone's done, when you've done that, let us know. It's good to have an idea of what the monetary terms are. But in terms of cash, we will use the value of 700 grams of silver. Why? Again, this is more beneficial for the poor. Let's say if we use the gold one is going to be a few £1,000s. I don't know the figures, but it's definitely going to be a few £1,000s for 85 grams of gold. Silver, on the other hand, is going to be a few £100s. So in a community of, let's say, 1,000 people, if you use gold as the standard for cash, there may only be a handful of people who end up paying zakat. If you use silver, there's actually going to be a lot more people who are going to be paying zakat, and then the more deprived of the community will be better looked after in that way. But that's the basis for cash. It then brings us on to the nisab for animals. I'm going to miss that, as I said to you, turning over. So you've got zakat for different types of animals, zakat on horses. And in my book, I don't know the digital versions that you've got, is page 407 for zakat on merchandise of trade.
4.5 grams of the gold, 420 pounds.
Okay, yeah. So that's a rough idea I had in my head. So for about £4,500 for silver. Now imagine how many people in the community actually have £4,500 saving each year, aside from their debts and aside from their basic necessity. But £420 is much less. So it's more beneficial for the poor to use that nisab. So merchandise, let's have a look at the text first, and then I'll explain to you in simple terms what that means in real terms. So the meaning of merchandise of trade is all things that a person uses for trade, even if they are grazing animals, crops, or fruits. Anything that you're buying and selling, houses, cars, even though normally when you're calculating zakat, you don't calculate the value of your house. You don't calculate the house value of your car or transport. Doesn't matter how expensive they are, because they are your basic necessities. But if somebody's buying and selling properties, they must pay zakat on those properties that they have purchased in order to sell, because that is their merchandise. On the other hand, if somebody's bought properties to let, that's a different ruling. Then basically it will just be like standard normal zakat, as in whatever income is coming, you'll calculate beginning and end of the year, and savings you'll pay zakat on. But if somebody's buying properties with the intention of selling, and they're in his possession for over a year, is liable for zakat on them. Same with cars, same with anything. Anything. It could be anything that is traded in. The merchandise or goods used for trade is to be evaluated at the end of every lunar year. If its value reaches the nisab of gold and silver, then one is required to pay 2.5% of its worth. Now, interesting fact I'm reminded of here, because it says lunar year. It's a good idea to pay your zakat regularly in a particular Islamic month rather than one of the Gregorian months. So don't keep your zakat calculations like every June, every July, or whatever. Do it every Ramadan, every Shawwal, every Shaban, whatever, every Islamic month. Why? Because obviously, because of the difference in number of days, the lunar year is approximately 10 days shorter than the Gregorian year. After about 35 years, you have missed a whole year's zakat. So that's something to keep in mind. During this evaluation, it's necessary to keep in mind the benefit of the poor and unfortunate person, meaning that if the merchandise of trade amounts to the nisab of silver, if it is evaluated against it, though would not amount to the nisab of gold if it was evaluated against it, then the goods are to be evaluated against silver. It's the same principle as cash. If you got more than 420 quid, pay zakat on it. Don't wait till you get over £4,500. Same with merchandise. However, if the merchandise of trade reaches the nisab of both gold and silver, though the evaluation against one of these would be more beneficial for the people than one is to evaluate the goods to what is more beneficial of the people. So it's always looking at the benefit of the poor. Right, that's it. Those are all the nisabs. Turning over to, in my book, page 410, Masariful Zakat, the recipients of Zakat, couple of pages over. So who is eligible to receive zakat? The recipients of zakat are 8, as Allah mentions in His sayings, and there's a verse of the Quran mentioned there, إِنَّمَا الصَّدَقَاتُ لِلْفُقَرَاءِ وَالْمَسَاكِينَ وَالْعَامِلِينَ عَلَيْهَا وَالْمُؤَلَّفَةِ قُلُوبِهِمْ وَفِي الرِّقَابِ وَالْغَارِمِينَ وَفِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَابْنِ السَّبِيلِ. Right? These are the recipients of zakat. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that to be zakat is for the poor, destitute and helpless, those who are employed to administer the funds, those whose hearts have been recently reconciled to the truth, for the freeing of a slave, the one in debt, those fighting for Islam, and the wayfarer. So these are the different categories. Amongst them, there is a category of those who are collecting zakat. This doesn't apply anymore. This was abandoned in the time of Sayyidina Usman, Sayyidina Usman radiallahu ta'ala. Right? The reason why, because by that time, the Islamic lands had expanded to quite vast areas around the globe. And it became extremely difficult to have a centralized system where all the zakat was collected, brought into one central pot, and then distributed everywhere. So at that point, he felt it best that people should distribute their zakat locally on their own sort of initiative. So those don't exist anymore, the collectors of zakat. Also from this, mu'allafat al-qulub, which is mentioned, those disbelievers who were given zakat in order to soften their hearts and bring them closer to Islam. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala, with agreement of all the Sahaba, he lifted this and he said, Islam no longer requires this. We're not a religion who is small in number, and now, there's no such fear associated. Alhamdulillah, Allah has given us independence, and so that was lifted as well. So that's also not included as well. So any of the others, obviously, there isn't much slavery of that form that exists now. So that's all in helping freeing a slave, that really doesn't apply now as well. So out of the 8, those 3 are already immediately sort of gone. Then you have the 5 remaining categories. These are the 8 types of recipients which zakat is forwarded to, provided 2 conditions are met. So in order to receive zakat, 2 conditions: 1, that the person is Muslim, and number 2 is not the father, children, or wife of the person paying the zakat, because he's required to fund them anyway through his general expenses. So the term we use in Arabic is usul and furu'. Asal means roots, far' means branches. You can't give to your father, grandfather, great-grandfather, anybody above. You can't give to your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, anyone below. And you can't give to your spouse either. Anybody else, as long as they are eligible to receive, as in they are below the threshold, and they are not from the family of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they can receive zakat. One has the option of restricting the entire zakat to one of these categories. So you can give a little bit to each one of these categories, the poor, the destitute. So poor, basically somebody who has little means, destitute has no means at all. For somebody who's in debt, helping them get out of debt, and so on. You can give a little bit to each one. You can divide your zakat between however many poor people you want to, or you can give it all to just one person. Even if by giving your zakat to that one person himself then becomes eligible of paying zakat. Even then, there's no harm in giving it all to just one person as well. So each of these 8 categories, a needy person is the one who possesses wealth, though it does not amount to the nisab. So he's got some provisions, but he's below the nisab. Destitute, helpless person, miskeen, is someone who owns nothing. He's completely destitute. And the circumstances of the destitute are worse than that of a needy person. He would be considered more needy. Number 3 was those employed by the Islamic State to collect the zakat. As I mentioned, that sort of system doesn't exist anymore. Number 4, those whose hearts have recently reconciled are people who the Prophet ﷺ would give zakat to so that they would accept Islam, or new converts were given zakat to strengthen their faith, or zakat was given to people so that when they returned to their people, they would preach about Allah and His Messenger and people would accept Islam. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala, he discontinued this. Right? So we're obviously with the agreement of all the Sahaba. So by ijma, by consensus, this was discontinued. Number 5, slaves purchasing their freedom are slaves who make an agreement with their masters, and if they are paid a fixed amount of wealth to their masters, they will be freed. Islam therefore established a portion of zakat for them as it is considered concerned with their freedom. Islam said about a lot of rules about slavery. I often say this, the American slave trade only ended a couple hundred years ago, right, where people were kidnapped, put on boats, died, thousands of them in miserable circumstances, chucked in the sea without any disregard for human dignity, and then how they were treated once they got wherever they went. Islam started this process 1,500 years ago, pretty much. And this is one of those examples. Those in debt are persons who are in debt and unable to settle it, which brings them below the financial threshold. Number 7, striving in the path of Allah refers to soldiers who the Imam prepares for war with the intention of making high the word of Allah. And number 8, the traveler is a traveler who has no spending money at hand, therefore bringing his journey to a standstill and rendering him unable to reach his destination, even if he was extremely wealthy at home. He could be a millionaire in his own lands, but if he's traveling, he's stranded, he's cut off from all of his funds, then he's eligible for zakat, right? Even if he's got millions at home. Moving on then, what is zakat not permitted for? It's not permitted to allocate zakat for construction of a mosque, for the burial of a deceased, nor for the debt of the deceased, only for the living. It's not permitted to allocate. The reason why, because tamlik, ownership, is necessary. In zakat, you must transfer ownership of something to another person, and therefore not the debt of the deceased. It's not permitted to allocate zakat to buy a slave in order to free him, because the wealth of zakat is different to the wealth that is for general benefit of the people, and also because zakat has been outlined and specified by the lawgiver. That also answers a lot of questions. You can't use zakat for building roads, for building hospitals, for all sorts of building wells. You can't use it for communal purposes. It has to be handed over to somebody. There has to be an element of transfer ownership, not just money necessarily, but something needs to be handed over in terms of ownership to another person. So that's essential. And that's basically pretty much the masail of zakat. It goes on to sadaqat al-fitr from there. Just a couple of misconceptions. In relation to gold, this is often a misconception that a husband must pay zakat of the wife. If the wife doesn't work and she does fulfill her sort of role as a wife in the house, and she's basically doing work that she's not obligated to do in order to look after the children and the husband and his family, then it would be seen as a general act of decency if the husband would pay zakat on her behalf. Right? But it's not a legal matter. It's not by law. It doesn't have to. If the woman is, if she's got gold, for example, more than 85 grams, the liability is on her head, not the husband's. If he doesn't cooperate, if he doesn't pay, she should pay herself. Keep paying until she comes below the threshold, and then she won't have to. So that's the bottom line. If the circumstances are such, then he should, right, as a matter of decency, because she's not earning a salary or she's not working, she's not trading, and that's for the benefit of the family, then he should take that into consideration if it's possible for him. And if for any other reason, for any reason, he doesn't or he can't, she must pay it for herself. The obligation is not lifted. Sadqatul Fitr, looking at Sadqatul Fitr then, what obligates Sadqatul Fitr? Sadqatul Fitr is wajib upon one who meets three conditions. What are they? Number one, Muslim. Number two is a free person. And number three, he possesses the nisab, on top of the amount needed to cover his basic necessities and debts. It does not matter whether a person owns the minimum amount for a year or not, or whether it is growing or not. What happens is basically on the morning at Fajr time of Eid day, at that point, if somebody is above the nisab, he must pay Sadqatul Fitr for himself and also for his non-baligh children as well. So it's even upon children in the household. He must pay for himself and his non-baligh children. With relation to wife, for example, is the same mas'ala as I've already mentioned for zakat. When calculating zakat, sadaqatul fitr as well, you can remove your basic necessities. What are your basic necessities? What can you discount from that? Any debt that is immediately owing. I'll just answer because there's a lot of issues around mortgage, around other sort of short, long-term loans where you're paying off in increments. For zakat purposes, you can only deduct maximum of 1 year's repayments from your savings. Some scholars even say 1 month, that 1 month that you're paying. But maximum, according to all the scholars, is 1 year's repayment. Whatever. So, for example, if your repayments amount to £2,000, you've got, £5,000 in savings. To deduct £2,000, you still got 3,000 left over. It's above the nisab for silver, which is £420. You pay zakat on that remaining £3,000. So you can't say I've got 50,000 mortgage, so I can't pay zakat. Or I've got 100,000 mortgage, I can't pay zakat. It doesn't work like that. But the guardian is required to pay sadaqah on behalf of, from his own money for himself, his young children, and for his slave who works in the home. Though it is not necessary for him to pay the fitr from his money for his wife, his mature children, and neither his slave used for trade or his disobedient slave until he becomes obedient. The rich child who has money is to have it paid from that money, and the insane person takes the ruling of a child in that if the insane does not possess wealth, then it is to be paid for from the money of his guardian, though if the insane person possesses wealth, then the guardian pays it from that. Sadaqatul Fitr becomes obligatory on the dawn of Eid al-Fitr. It is therefore not obligatory on those who die prior to dawn. Also, the sadaqah is not required for those who are born or become Muslim after the dawn of Eid prayer. So a child, for example, born on Eid day, that year will not be liable for Sadaqatul Fitr. Additionally, it is recommended to pay the Sadaqatul Fitr after dawn arrives, but before the performance of the Eid prayer. Now, I normally recommend this, and I'll say this to everybody, you can pay beforehand. With the way the circumstances are today in this world, traditionally Sunnah was like, go and pay your Sadaqatul Fitr on the way to Eid namaz, because you'll encounter people who need it. Unless you're in that situation where you know somebody that you can hand it over to here on your way to Eid namaz, I would encourage paying it beforehand, sending it to someone who may use it and actually be able to benefit from it the way it was intended, whereby they can actually use it to have an Eid celebration. Don't bring it to the mosque. I've always discouraged this. Don't bring it to mosque on Eid day. Because what happens, and especially with various different masajids, sometimes it can basically sit in the account for quite a long time before it reaches God knows where and distributed how. But even if they're extremely efficient, like what's going to happen? It's going to be collected, it's going to be counted. There'll be some debating as to what's the best purpose to put it towards, and then the reward of your fasting remains suspended until your sadaqatul fitr is paid. Like the Prophet said, your fast remains suspended until it's given. But also the spirit of Islam and Ramadan, bring people into this celebration, get it to them in time for them to be able to utilize it, to have some kind of Eid, rather than coming on Eid day and then a few weeks later, sometimes even months later, it's going to get to its destination. There's also if a person pays Sadaqatul Fitr a day or two in advance, it's valid. Some scholars maintain that it may be paid in advance by 10 days, even halfway through Ramadan, while others held that it is valid to pay 1 month in advance, which is at the beginning of Ramadan. It's also been stated by some scholars that if it is advanced a year or two, it is still valid, while others held that if it is paid 10 years or more in advance, it's still valid. So really, there isn't an issue. Pay it during Ramadan at some point. And basically get it to somebody who can use it during Ramadan and for Eid as well. The sadaqah of fitr is not excused if it is delayed, even if one extended the delay. However, one has committed an offense due to that delay. So what can be used to pay sadaqatul fitr? Sadaqatul fitr can be paid with one of 4 following types of goods: wheat, dates, barley, and raisins. So sadaqatul fitr amount is calculated in these 4 ways. The amount due per person is half a measure of wheat, flour, or saviq, which is a mixture of wheat and barley, and may be given, or one may give 1 full measure of dates and barley. Out of these, the most expensive is probably dates. And if you calculate that with, a couple of grams of flour is not as much as a few grams of dates. So looking at all 4 of them, there's a variation. A good sort of average and round figure of £5, which obviously we have recommended, is somewhere in the middle. And it's a good value. And if you choose to pay the higher, you can calculate these yourself. If you choose to pay the higher amount, there's more sawab and reward for you. There's nothing stopping you to pay more or going beyond that. So according to Abu Hanifa, raisins are in the same grade as wheat, whereas Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad held that raisins are in the same grade as barley. The sa measure, according to the Egyptian scale, is 2 1/3 scoops with a ladle. So these are all traditional units, but we've already covered what the kilograms are previously. It's permitted to give Sadaqatul Fitr in cash that is equivalent to either one of the above. The most evident opinion upon which the fatwa is given is that paying the equivalent in cash is best, actually, rather than giving grains. For what is essential is that which is most beneficial for the poor and the needy. So recipients of Sadaqatul Fitr are the same as the recipients of the Zakat, and there's those 8 categories mentioned again. A person may restrict the total Sadaqah to one of these categories, even if all other types of recipients are present. Now, an important masala to finish with. This is the end of this section, and we're coming to the end of our seminar now as well. The last page, transferring the zakat, the sadaqah and zakat to another city. When zakat has been gathered after the completion of a year, and when the sadaqah al-fitr, which is necessary to pay, has been settled, it is disliked to transfer the wealth to another city. In particular, this would be more apt in Muslim countries, but even here in cities with large Muslim populations. Reason being, there is more than likely, pretty much definitely, there will be people in need in that community, and you are taking resources away from them, giving them to another community. Begins at home, doesn't it? So close to home first. So the distance between the so as long as the distance is between the two cities is less than that which one needs to become a traveler, unless in the other city there is a relative of the one who paid zakat or sadaqah, or unless in the other city there are people who are in greater need, or there are people who are more righteous, or in the other city there are people who would be more beneficial for the Muslim nation in that they would be a cause for teaching others knowledge. That's important. Transferring your zakat for the purpose of teaching knowledge. This is where, in some of our poor communities, like Pakistan, for example, where the madaris do not really, majority of them have no access to government funding. They're based purely on public funding. Majority of the students are from families who would be below the zakat threshold as well. And there's somebody there sensible enough to make use of the correct Shari procedure for that transfer of ownership to take place. This falls into there, that they are factories and outputs basically for knowledge of the deen, right, and should be prioritized. In these cases, it is not disliked to transfer the wealth to them from zakat or sadaqah. However, the best act is to distribute the zakat and sadaqah to the closest relatives. They take priority even if they're further away in distance. Closest relatives, followed by the next closest relatives, and so on. Thereafter, it is distributed to one's neighbors, then the people of one's era, and then to those in the same profession, and then to the people of that state. That's the recommendation. The only one thing that's not mentioned there, which I'll just finish with, is in order to receive zakat, you must be below the threshold. But there's one thing to remember. When paying zakat, you don't pay your zakat on your house, on your household items, on things of necessity, regardless of the value. However, the criteria is a little bit more stringent when it comes to taking zakat. So for somebody to take zakat, not only must they be below the threshold, but any items that they own which are outside of their basic necessity. So basically, even if there's clothing, then clothing for summer, clothing for winter, any additional clothing, the value will be calculated. Right? Utensils for use, anything additional to that will be calculated. Bedding, which is for use winter and summer, anything additional to that will be calculated. So for recipients of zakat, the criteria is a little bit more stringent. If you genuinely believe that somebody is eligible for zakat, you've done basic checks, that's sufficient. It's not necessary for you to go and pry deeply into their lives to go and actually check what they own and possess and check the value of that. Islam doesn't obligate you to do any of that. If you believe, based on reasonable assumption, that that person, and not just assumption, but reasonable sort of means that you can see visually or whatever, and you believe that person is eligible for zakat, then they can be given zakat. So that concludes our seminar for today. We have, I believe, covered pretty much all of the essential masail regarding fasting of various different types of zakat and sadaqatul fitr as well. And again, for all people who are still, for example, living with your parents, etc., if you're baligh, your own calculations, if your parents choose to take you into their calculations, that is an act of generosity on their part, but the legal liability is on your head. So therefore, these masail should be known and put into practice. Any questions now, either in relation to fasting that you might have had previously missed, or anything in relation to zakat or fitran?
Is paying zakat confirmed as soon as reach the misal amount, or does you have to wait a year?
1 year. For zakat, the condition is 1 year. For sadaqatul fitr, it doesn't have to be 1 year. That person could have been absolutely penniless on the last day of Ramadan, and that night he comes into some kind of money. Then in the morning he'll pay sadaqatul fitr. So for sadaqatul fitr, there's no condition of 1 year. Zakat is only liable on wealth that you have owned for 1 year.
Does the same apply for merchandise and stock?
Yeah.
You have to have that for 1 year.
Yeah. So any type of zakat, 1 year.
On the merchandise of stock, you pay the zakat on the value, the purchase
Yeah.
value of the goods, or do you pay the zakat?
No, it's the actual purchase value, is what you would have purchased traded.
How about in regards to pensions then? For example, you got a pension, but you don't have access to it till you're retiring. It's got
Technically, you wouldn't be liable. Like, there's two things. One is liability. One is immediate obligation to pay, to discharge that liability. So the obligation of discharging that liability technically may not come into effect until you have access to it. You're still liable though. It is a good idea to keep paying it off, because otherwise at the end, number one, you'll pay a cumulative value, and number two, you don't exactly know how long you're going to be before you have access to it, or whether you might actually die before then. Same goes with debts. Very common masla. I'll just quickly explain the different types of debts. If you have looked, and so we know about debts. I've already explained to you about the long-term debts. Short-term debts you can deduct, which basically you should be paying straight away. What if you've given money, loaned out money to somebody? You're on the other side of the debt. So I've given somebody £10,000 to borrow. That's well above the threshold. I'm not liable to discharge that obligation until I receive the money back. But if I don't get it back for 5 years, I'm going to have to pay cumulatively for those 5 years when I do get it back. So if you're hopeful that it will be returned, it's better to pay annually. Keep that in your calculation. Otherwise, you need to remember to pay 5 years when you do receive it, because the liability only kicks in once you receive it back. If somebody's not acknowledging the debts anymore, so for example, you gave someone £1,000 and he's saying, no, I'm not paying it back, or you didn't give it to me in the first place, then you're not obligated to pay zakat. Anything else?
You gold and silver, but if you're looking at other jewels, for example, diamonds, is there a
No,
technicality there?
no. That unless it's basically a treasure trove, as sort of as we've not really covered that section. That would be basically coming into money in the form of those raw materials, but and otherwise, no. And I want to retain on your question in terms of caught me a little bit off guard in terms of purchase or resale. I'm going to double check on that, and inshallah, if anybody, but us in particular, if you remind me on Jummah, I'll come back to on Jummah, inshallah.
I think it relates to, because there's purchase stock, there's value of saleable stock.
Yeah.
And then after the value of saleable stock is the expenses,
Yeah.
which are the tax, transportation,
Yeah.
etc.
So I will sort of give a more detailed response, inshallah, on that.
So just further to the merchandise value for a year, how would you calculate that? Would you have a value the previous year, and would you pay according to the previous year value to this year? Or
I'm not sure if
so,
that.
for instance, last year you had £10,000 stock.
Yeah.
This year you've got 15,000.
Yeah.
Does
You
that
pay the 15,000. It's the function is similar to your standard zakat. So if your savings were 10,000 last year, by end of the next year, it's gone to 15,000. The peaks and troughs in the middle are ignored. Therefore, you calculate on the value that's at the end of the year. So, but that one I'll come back to, inshallah. Anything else?
question online.
Yeah.
One, can children pay zakat or sadaqatul fitr on behalf of their parents who don't work?
So when we say children, I'm assuming these are not actually children. We mean, as in sons and daughters paying for their parents, those who themselves are baligh and so on. You can, but you should basically inform them, and it should be done with their sort of knowledge and agreement.
What should you do if you live in a community where it's difficult to find someone who's eligible for sadaqatul fitr?
It's not actually prohibited. So it's not actually prohibited to move zakat funds from one city to another. That was a recommendation. Priority is close relatives. The Prophet said giving sadaqah to relatives, close relatives, is double reward for sadaqah and also for maintaining ties of kinship. So the closer the relative, the more right they have over you. If there are people in your close relatives, blood relatives, who are below that threshold, then help them first, and then go beyond that. And that could be, like I said, with the relatives, they could be at a distance. Then, if there is people that you're aware of within your community, they are more rightful of that sadaqah before you transport it to another city. But then it also mentions that exception about you can, and it would be better perhaps to send to another city if there are people there who are going to help further the cause of deen and knowledge of the deen. That's all. Okay, so we're done. There's nothing more online. I don't think if there's anything else here. And we'll conclude with dua. اللهم صل على سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا مولانا محمد وبارك وسلم. اللهم ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم. اللهم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا اغفر لنا ولإخواننا الذين سبقونا بالإيمان. اللهم ربنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين. Ilahul Alameen, we ask you to accept this humble effort from all of us, reward us infinitely for this effort of pursuit of knowledge. And we ask you to allow us to reach Ramadan and to reap the rewards of this blessed month spiritually and in every possible way. Make this a means of barakah and blessing for all of us. Sallallahu ta'ala ala khairi khalqi Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi. Jazakallah, thank you for attending. And inshallah, keep